Hello students, this is Professor Watson, and I'll be giving you these video presentations from time to time this semester. The idea is to take some of the content that I might normally put into a class lecture and turn it into a brief video like this one so that you can watch and absorb on your own time. That'll free up more class time to work with the concepts that I've introduced. So instead of just a straight lecture class, we'll actually have time for you to do the kind of work that you're expected to do in a lit class when we're all together. So today, we're going to talk about asking good discussion questions. The reason this is an important skill for you all to gain is if you can write a good discussion question, that means that you have understood what you're reading and you've also understood the kinds of approaches that I'm asking you to take to these literary texts. So one way that you can demonstrate the kinds of things that I'm trying to teach you is through writing good discussion questions, and it's something you'll have to do for the Blackboard site every week. So I want to look at a few considerations for this today and try to give you some very sort of specific advice to guide you toward writing better questions. And this is something we'll practice on all semester. Good discussion questions tend to be open-ended. So oftentimes these sentences will start with why or how, and most importantly, they open themselves to more than one answer. So you don't want your discussion question to be able to be answered with yes or no, or a question like 2 times the square root of 5. The best open-ended questions spark a discussion because they ask people to take a position on a question that doesn't have a simply correct answer. And I know this is something that drives some people crazy about literature classes. They want to have a solid answer to a question, one thing that's correct and not incorrect. But when I ask you to write these discussion questions, I'm really asking you to kind of provoke the kind of responses that go past yes or no, that aren't bounded by an idea of correctness. So, the first point about discussion questions I want to make is that they tend to be open-ended. The next thing is that good discussion questions usually focus on a specific part of the object of inquiry. So whatever it is that you're reading or studying, you want to isolate something specific to ask about. So think about this. If you say to somebody, hey, how about that World War II? They probably won't be able to respond. If, on the other hand, you ask something like, was it morally right to drop nuclear bombs on Japan, you're going to get a much more interesting reaction. So remember, you want to take some specific part of the thing you're studying, and you want your question to spark conversation by aiming beyond the yes or no kind of answer. So in the context of our class, what I hope is that you'll be able to isolate specific passages of literary texts or specific lines of poetry to ask your questions about. Okay, good discussion questions usually move the discussion toward higher learning objectives. This is the third quality of good discussion questions that we're going to talk about. So this is Bloom's taxonomy of learning objectives. You may have seen this thing before. This is like gospel in certain quarters. This is kind of a list of cognitive activities in which you might engage during a learning session. The real split here is kind of between those bottom 3 and the top 3. Remembering and understanding are really important, right? So if you take an anatomy class, you'll need to remember the names of all the bones. And you might have to understand how the muscles articulate them. And you might even have to apply the kind of knowledge you've learned about hinge joints from one part of the body to another. So those are all really important tasks, and they're things that I'm going to expect you to do on your own as you're reading. But of course, if you have questions at these levels, if you're simply not understanding what's happening in the text, that can be a great place for us to start our discussions as well. But when you're writing your own discussion questions, you want to try to move up out of just understanding or remembering and into these higher level skills of analyzing, evaluating, and creating. So, if you think about it, those upper levels are much more likely to yield open-ended questions than the lower levels. They tasks of analysis, evaluation, and creation don't really have single responses that will satisfy the question that's been asked. So rather than asking what happened in chapter 1, a sort of remembering task, you might ask how the tone of a given passage interacts with the content of the passage, asking for something more like analysis and evaluation. We may return to this taxonomy later, but it's just another way to sort of think about how to ask these kinds of bigger questions that just go a little bit further. Let's talk about ways that you can improve discussion questions. A lot of times people will start from questions that maybe are closed-ended, maybe aren't going anywhere really exciting yet, but it's not hard to turn those into really good questions. So, here's an example. We might start with a question like, where is the Castle of Otranto set? This is something I absolutely want you to know for a class, for the class that we're taking right now, but it's not something that can lead to much discussion. However, if we were to ask, what are some reasons Walpole might have set this novel in Italy? There you have a much more interesting question. There are multiple possible answers here, and no one has the absolute right answer to sort of shut the discussion down. And this is actually something that we'll talk about the meaning of Italy for 18th century England. Here's another sort of factual question. What is Manfred's wife's name? Again, not something that's really up for discussion, something that you ought to know if you're reading the book. But following that same line of thought, you might say, the characters in this book have really odd-sounding names like Manfred and Matilda. How do you square those weird names with Walpole's claim that he's writing realistic fiction? And if we were to take a wider scope on this, we would find that there are all kinds of 18th century novels that have very realistic-sounding names like Pamela or Tom Jones. There's a whole tradition in 18th century literature of these really common-sounding names, novels about real people. And here we have Walpole going off in this other direction completely. So this might be something that we could really get some mileage out of. You might start with just a personal reaction. That huge helmet was awesome. I don't really think any of you are going to think the helmet was awesome, but, who knows, maybe. You could turn that into a question, too, though, by asking something like, what could Walpole be saying to or about his readers by putting something as unbelievable as a giant helmet this early in the book? What does it tell us about the kind of reality he's describing? You might ask a question about, this is a concept we'll talk about repeatedly during the semester, the idea of a contract between the author and the reader. What is Walpole telling us about the sort of rules of this world? So those are a few ways that you can sort of improve your discussion questions. So what does all this mean for you? Well, as you read, I want you looking out for anything that seems odd. When something doesn't make sense, or when something just doesn't fit with its surroundings, you should stop and look around at the text. So you might start with one weird point, like, why a huge helmet? So that's really the first takeaway. As you read, I want you to note things that are strange. So go ahead and write in the book. We'll talk about this more in class, but you should be marking your text. Always have a pen in hand when you're reading, or a pencil, if you prefer. So that's one thing. The next thing is, see if you can connect any of these oddities that you're observing as you go. So a really great technique for writing a discussion question is to bring together two things that strike you as odd. So that's my second takeaway. After you've noted your strange points, turn those observations into questions and post them to Blackboard. My goal is to use your questions to structure our discussions in class. So the last takeaway here is, this is your class. This education belongs to you, not to me. So I want this class to address the things that you find. And the more active you are, the more you're going to get out of this class. Okay, so I want you to go and read the introductions to the Castle of Otranto and the first chapter, as well as the background materials on the Sublime that I'm going to post to Blackboard. And we'll get together and work on all of this stuff on Thursday.